which brings us full circle, actually, because this is where we started, right? Thinking about how a word might bother us doesn't make it wrong. And the word literally is actually that exact word, which is funny. I wanted to ask something that's been on my mind. I think I already know your answer, but I'm curious. It feels like we are getting more lazy with language. It feels like all the changes are in place to communicate lazily. And I have a feeling you're going to say, no, that's not the case because you are defending bad language. But it also feels like that could work because, I mean, everything we're trying to do is more efficient. It's more time restricted. It's everybody's busier. Is there any truth to that?
Well, it's
and we're just getting lazy.
I mean, okay, there's a lot of different. I'm going to step back and rephrase several things here. Lazy is a very evaluative word for simplification, right? And what you're saying is like we're simplifying things. But to that, I'd say, well, progressive is actually complicated. And that's a new thing we're doing. It's a lot more complicated. You know, you actually hear more and more people using multiple modals. Like he might could do that, which is a very Southern feature. But you say,
I'm sorry, he might could do that?
Yes,
people are saying that?
People are saying that. Or they're using different, like he will possibly might do that. You know, you do hear that come up. Those are actually increased complication. So we often say, you know, when a Southerner says, I might could do that, you might say, oh my God, he makes no sense. That's stupid. That's simple. Right. Well, it's not actually, it's more complicated. And it's a Scots-Irish feature that came over with early colonization, and it just happened to be retained in the South because that's where a lot of Scots-Irish settlement happened. So it has a really interesting history, but it's not simplification. Or if you hear people, I've heard people complain about athlete, the word athlete, people say athlete. Well, again, that's not simplification. That's complication. So I think what I'm trying to point out here is what we pay attention to might be what we see as simplification, but that's actually not true of our speech. We don't only do things that simplify. But to that, I'd say, look at Old English. It had case endings. It had case marking. It had gender marking. So whether it was masculine, feminine, or neuter. So, for example, wife was neuter in Old English, which is kind of odd, but still a fact, right? You had number marked on words as well. You had verb classes. So you had strong class verbs and weak class verbs, which is why you say things like swim, swam, swum, because that's a strong class verb versus something like, jog, jogged, which is a weak class verb. Well, the majority of verbs in Old English were strong class verbs. We didn't have that many weak class verbs, which were ed endings. But over time, that got simplified, if you want to say it that way, where all these interior changes in words like swim, swam, sung, sing, swim, swam, swum, sing, sang, sung, those type things simplified over time. So more and more words just got ed added. So we have been doing this simplification process for centuries, but 20, 30 years ago, most people didn't say, oh, look what dumbasses we are because we don't use case endings anymore. So, I think you need the long perspective here in terms of the idea of simplification. But I think the point being, no, we're not getting lazier. Are we always moving towards more efficient communication? Yes. And does language tend to be super redundant? Absolutely. So, for example, if I say I have $3, I'm double marking a plural. Because if you're not, if you're not from the outer space, that 3 means I have several. I have more than $1, which means it's plural by default. So I don't really need an S on that to mark it. And in fact, we're very arbitrary in what we've kept from Old English. Plural marking just happened to be one of the things that we left. And we only took one type of plural marker from Old English. So I used to say things like shoein and iron, just like oxen and children, because that's an Old English plural marker. So I just kept one plural marker. I've simplified that, but I don't really need a plural marker at all if I note plural in some other fashion, like 3. So redundancy reduction is a really integral part of language and has been over time. We don't want to be more complex than we need to. I mean, no one likes redundancy. If you had a company and you were running it and you had a lot of redundancy, what is a better way to run that company? Is it simpler and lazier to get rid of redundancy? No, it's more efficient and better. So why do we think about running businesses that way, but get upset when people run language that way?
I love the idea of, the redundancy in language is what we might actually be getting rid of. That's such a better way of putting it in general. And the more we've had this conversation, the more I just realize like I'm becoming the old guy, which is just fascinating to think about.
We're all the old
question.
guy.
I know, right?